Joint special meeting of the City Council and the Planning Commission, May 17th, 2022. Roll call, please.
Planning Commissioner Gene Kuznick is absent. Commissioner Alpert.
Here.
Commissioner Edwards. Here. Commissioner Marks is absent, and Commissioner Wallace.
I'm here.
Thank you. And Councilmember Armstrong.
Here.
Councilmember Perkins.
Here.
Councilmember Zafar.
Here.
Vice Mayor Burrows.
Here.
And Mayor Hudson.
Here, let's get right to the hit of the evening. That's 2.1, the Joint City Council and Planning Commission public hearing. Draft 2023-2031 sixth cycle of the housing element as part of the General Plan 2040 update. Staff report, Cindy Yee.
Thank you and good evening. I will go ahead and start the presentation and then I'll hand it off to our teaming partner, Veronica Tam, with Veronica Tam and Associates to provide the majority of tonight's presentation. Again, just an introduction to the staff that is working on the general plan and housing element update. Debbie Chamberlain, Lauren Barr, myself as the project manager, and Ryan Driscoll. We're all here today for any questions that you might have. With the city working on the housing element specifically is Veronica Tam and Associates. You may remember Veronica Tam during our fourth cycle housing element update. And she's back for our sixth cycle update along with Rincon Consultants who you've met through our housing opportunity sites work. And so this evening we have Veronica Tam here to provide an overview of the project and go over our public draft of our housing element. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Veronica.
Hi, Veronica.
Hi, thank you for having me back, and great pleasure to be back in the city of San Ramon, a very nice city and definitely very nice city hall. I was at the old city hall before with the fourth cycle housing element. So anyway, as Cindy mentioned, what I'd like to do tonight is just to give an overview of the housing element and what are some of the requirements and the key components of the draft housing element. For the benefits of those who might not have heard some of this presentation before, I just want to give a little bit background of what the housing element is and what are the requirements. Certainly, the housing element is part of your general plan. It's a mandatory component of your general plan. It has to be updated every 8 years or so, and the time frame that we're working on is 2023 to 2031. It has to have some kind of internal consistency with the rest of your general plan, all other elements, particularly with your land use element, because that really determines how much residential development and where it can occur within your city. We also need to, when we're updating the housing element, to address changes in state law. Some of you probably noticed that since 2017, there's been a lot of changes to state law relating to housing, and that's this housing element reflects a lot of those changes. As part of this general plan update and the housing element, too, there is update to the zoning code and your climate action plan. I went a little bit ahead of myself with the slide, but again, what we are talking about, the housing element is it's a little bit different from the rest of your general plan, is in that it has to be reviewed by a state agency for compliance with state law. That's the only element of the general plan that has to go through that kind of excruciating or really stringent review by the state. A key component of that review is the regional housing needs assessment. Virtually no jurisdiction can have a housing element complying with state law if it's not able to meet the regional housing needs assessment. There is also a statutory deadline. We are dealing with January 31st, 2023. That is the statutory deadline of the housing element. As one of the new state law is a requirement to make sure that the draft housing element is available for 30-day public review before we're able to even submit that to the state. That's brand new requirement. We must take 30 days to allow the housing element to be reviewed by the public for 30 days, and we must take 10 business days to address comments before we can submit it to the state. With the housing element, the centerpiece of the housing element is certainly your plan of actions, the housing plan. But to get to that plan of action, there are many steps involved in updating the housing element. We need to look at the needs in your community. What are the housing needs in your community based on demographic, housing trends, and certainly for special needs population. As defined by state law, special needs groups are the elderly, disabled, homeless, large households, household with 5 or more members, female-headed households, homeless, and farm workers, and any other type of special needs groups that you may want to define locally. We also looked at what you have been able to achieve over the last 8 years based on the implementation of your 5th cycle housing element. We also need to look at the constraints to housing development. And when it comes to constraints, again, there's been a lot of changes to state law, and that's the reason why relating to government code, relating to zoning and regulations, relating to development regulations, we have to look at it differently compared to your current housing element. Resources and sites inventory, we have mentioned before, that's the key component of the housing element, how you're going to be able to meet your regional housing needs assessment for all income levels. That's the most critical review of HCD. And what is also very different and very significant change in the state law is a new piece of legislation, AB 686, affirmatively furthering fair housing. It requires the housing element to be assessed and also planned for from an equity perspective. And we have to look at 5 different themes. We'll go into that a little bit later. But when we looked at your plan of actions, when we look at your sites, we have to look at 5 different themes when relating to affirmatively furthering fair housing. Just to briefly go over some of the recent changes to state law, adequate sites requirement AB 1397, which really sets very high standards what constitute a site. And it also requires that you to replace existing units when existing units are being demolished to make room for future development. Now, what makes it very difficult is we all know that your regional housing needs assessment this round is very large compared to your 5th cycle or 4th cycle. But then they also raise the bar of what constitutes a site. So that makes it very difficult, very challenging for a lot of communities in updating the housing element this round. Monitoring of no net loss, that's a new law, as your sites are being developed. When you are not developing at the density or at the income level you anticipate, you have to continuously monitor your ability to meet the regional housing needs allocation throughout the entire process of the housing element. Now, in the past, all you have to do is we met it at the time of the housing element and your obligations are fulfilled. Now, ongoing every year, you have to continue to monitor your site's capacity for your remaining regional housing needs allocation. As I mentioned before, AB 686 affirmatively furthering fair housing and meaningful actions to achieve that. There are 5 different themes that we have to look at: your fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity and activities that you're going to take. New opportunities in high resource areas. Most of the city of San Ramon are high resource. That's not necessarily an issue, but what you do have to recognize is that the state doesn't want you to put all the housing just in one location. You want to spread it throughout the city, and you also need to promote housing mobility in a sense that you want to make sure that there are different types of housing available for your residents so that they have the options to move within your city or to move in, move out, or within your city. Place-based strategies for neighborhood improvements. How do you complement your site's inventory strategy where you are going to plan on a lot of your new units? How do you complement that with improvements in order to provide amenities and services for your residents? And then to also improve areas that may be considered somewhat underserved today. Tenant protection and anti-displacement, that's another theme of the fair housing because of the economic pressure that we see today with the high costs. And what is the city going to do to provide for affordable housing and also to provide some kind of tenant protection? There are also legislations relating to removing governmental constraints to to development. SB 9, we all know about housing development approvals, particularly when it comes to single-family neighborhoods. That's just a process that you have to have in place to comply with state law. Reduce fees and relaxing development standards and making sure that your development standards are objective, SB 330. Streamline processing. There are a lot of bills that require you to streamline your processing of residential development. And as I mentioned before, objective design standards, that's a requirement of state law. Expanding housing options as that relates to the housing mobility we talked about. Are you going to be able to provide a variety of housing types to meet the diverse needs of your community? Accessory dwelling units, I think we've all heard a lot about that in the last few years. Every time there have been like multiple bills changing and amending the ADUs. That's certainly an opportunity for putting housings in your community in high resource areas. Supportive housing, this is housing for persons with disabilities and persons who are transitioning from homelessness. There's a new bill called Lobaria navigation centers. That's not exactly, the term is a little misleading. I always have a difficult time explaining to people with just the name of it. But what it really is like a center that allows somebody who's formerly homeless, but they're really ready to be transitioned to live in permanent housing, but maybe they're waiting for a unit to be available, and that's the type of kind of transitional housing for them to to go into permanent housing. There is also a new bill that allows religious facility to provide housing on site if they're residentially zoned and allow them to have relaxed development standards, particularly relating to parking, a relief in parking if a religious property is interested in provide housing and they're residentially zoned. This is certainly actually a trend. In California, we've seen a lot of religious facilities due to like declining attendance at the church or for services or remote services that a lot of religious facilities are utilizing this opportunity to either lease the land or get some funding for their own operation. There's been also multiple bills relating to density bonus, particularly for housing in near transit centers. What we had talked about earlier too is that your regional housing needs allocation, that's the most important, most challenging component of the housing element, but it's also most important when it comes to HCD's review. Your regional housing needs allocation this round is 5,111 units divided into 4 income categories, and you must plan for your housing according to these income categories. But one thing I do want to emphasize to the public who may not have heard this presentation before is that still the regional housing needs allocation at this point is still a planning goal. It's not a production requirement. You must plan for it. And the state use density as a proxy to feasibility. So you're not necessarily, your housing element is not saying that you have to build 1,500 units of very low income units, because it's very expensive to build affordable housing. The deeper the income level, the higher requires subsidies, and most jurisdictions would not have that financial capacity to actually build these units. But what it does require you to do is that at least at sites that are 30 units to the acre, that's considered to be feasible to facilitate lower income housing. And you must have enough sites that are zoned at least 30 units to the acre to accommodate your lower income RENA, which is about 2,300 units total with very low and low. Moderate and above moderate income doesn't have a default density per state law, but we kind of graduated it from the different density categories. So moderate income would be somewhere between 20 to 30 units to the acre, and above moderate income would be primarily your single family homes and ownership type of housing. So meeting your regional housing needs allocation, we started off from your RENA, and we're allowed to project have some credits into the future, how much ADUs you have in the city. Now, this is per state law, we can only do it based on your trend. Your trend is not very active ADU market at this time. And so based on your historical trend, we could only credit about 70 units of ADUs for the next 8 years. And the income distribution is based on a rent survey conducted by ABAC and has been verbally approved by the state in terms of the income distribution that we can use. We can also credit projects that's been approved or entitled, but not really building yet, but with the ability to be constructed within the next 8 years. We do have quite a bit of that, over 2,400 units of that being entitled already. So you have a total credits of over 2,500 units, and subtracting that from your overall RENA, we have a remaining RENA obligation of 2,583 units. That we must identify sites to accommodate that. And whether they will be built or not, we don't know. We can't predict the market, but whether they can, and that's what we are looking at. What we started up with is, are there sites that you have identified in your fourth cycle housing element and your fifth cycle housing element that continue to be feasible today or available today? So we were able to get about 622 units from sites that were from your previous housing elements that remain to be available, but that's definitely not adequate to accommodate your overall RENA. What staff and you've been briefed many times in the past few months about how to get the sites available. There will be rezoning going to take place. We do take a fairly conservative assumptions that when projects are coming over to the city, is not going to be all lower income, even though the density can be feasible. But some of them, we just assume that the inclusionary requirements, some of them we do a little bit more aggressive as they go further into the future. But in order to get to your lower income RENA, you do have to have a larger market rate housing in order to get to that number. And so the rezoning, based on a lot of factors, including discussions with property owners, there are going to be rezoning over like 5,000 units. Overall, we'll be able to meet the RENA with some surplus, which is recommended by the state because of the AB 166, the no net loss requirement. You don't want your site's inventory to be exactly what you need, because the moment you start a building and you lose some units, then you run into a situation that you don't have enough sites and you have to find sites to replenish your site's inventory. So the state's recommendation is between 15 to 30% of your site's inventory as a buffer. So what staff has done is to identify sites to give you right in between about a 20 to 20% buffer. So there are some notable, when we put together the housing element, there are some notable policy directions to the current housing element that we want to kind of focus on. One is definitely to implement the city's new inclusionary housing and affordable housing linkage fee program, and that is probably the most realistic tool that you have in providing affordable housing in a community like yours, very high cost. Encourage infill development projects near employment, services, and transportation. This is also the concept of bringing new opportunities in areas with resources. New developments that would meet objective design standards. We also want to facilitate a variety of housing types that relates to the housing mobility issue that we talked about. We also want to pursue some actions and policies that would mitigate economic displacement. And again, this is the requirement of the affirmatively furthering fair housing. The other two new policy directions that we have is distribute new affordable housing in the city in a way that we don't concentrate lower income housing or higher density housing in particular locations and neighborhoods. We also want to employ place-based strategies for neighborhood improvements. So a lot of these are related to the new requirements of affirmatively furthering fair housing that certainly has become the most difficult, aside from the sites inventory, the most difficult component of HCD's review. Just to give you statistics, the Southern California Association of Governments, the housing element precedes yours. Theirs was due in October 2021. There are 197 jurisdictions in SCAG region. As of today, there are only 12 jurisdictions, 12 of the 197 that have gone through completely successfully with the HCD review. Everybody is grinding through that process in Southern California right now. So having said that, we haven't learned a lot from what's happening in Southern California. We are hoping to bring this housing element to you that would give you what knowledge that we have learned from Southern California that would be a more successful and smooth review of the housing element. The new 2023 to 31 housing element has 22 housing programs. What the state has also changed in their review of the housing element is the programs need to have actions, it needs to have outcomes. If you're just continuing to implement existing policies and codes, they don't necessarily consider that as a housing element program. So a lot of the restructuring of the housing element is due to that particular review requirement. The key programs that we have, inclusionary housing and commercial linkage fee, we do want to input in a component there that you would periodically review and update your requirements to make sure that it reflects the market conditions and that is appropriately for the current market that you're dealing with. Continue to implement the below market rate homeownership program. We heard from a lot of your residents that they want to have the opportunity to own housing in San Ramon. And so having this program is, again, one of the major tool that the city has to provide affordable ownership opportunities to a younger generation. Program 13 is adequate sites and monitoring. This is the commitment that we are going to rezone the sites by the end of 2022, because what we want to achieve is that by the statutory deadline of the housing element, by the time we adopt the housing element, we would be considered to have adequate sites with development standards and zoning in place already. And so that would actually exempt us from some additional penalties or requirements if you're unable to do it by the end of the year. So we want to achieve that and be exempt for those additional requirements. By right approval, this is a new requirement of the housing element law, AB 1397. One of the things that we want to be exempt from is this by right approval. There are different types of housing sites that would be subject to the by right approval. By right meaning no discretionary review, no CEQA, and no public hearings. So when you come to by right approval, there are three types of projects that sites that we have that are subject to by right. Sites that are reused from your previous cycle if they're non-vacant, if they're reused from the fourth and fifth cycle. If they're non-vacant, and they're reused from the fifth cycle, those two that we have no way of avoiding it, that is just part of state law. The other piece of the by right requirement is that if you cannot complete the rezoning by the end of the year, and you have to do the rezoning of your adequate sites past the statutory deadline, all of those rezone sites would be considered a shortfall sites that you are rezoning to meet the RENA, and they would be subject to by right. And that's the reason why we set the objective of doing all the rezoning by the end of the year so that we can be exempt from that. Replacement housing, this is the requirement that when you demolish existing housing for, in order to make room for additional housing, you need to replace it when it's being occupied or deed restricted as housing for lower income households. This is not very different than the state density bonus replacement requirements. It's just being consistent with that. But because you have an inclusionary requirement, most likely people will be subject to the density requirement, and most people would be subject to the replacement requirement under density bonus anyway. So that's not particularly anything would be considered new to the city. Zoning code amendments, there are a variety, the number of zoning code amendments that we have to go through in order to meet the variety of housing types relating to what I've mentioned before, low barrier navigation center, supportive housing. There is requirement for parking standards for emergency shelters. There is new density bonus, new ADU requirements, all these zoning code requirements that the city would have to go through. But you can, most of these, you can do it either concurrently with all your rezoning efforts, or you can do it within a year or two of the housing element. We also have a program relating to the Citywalk master plan. Right now that you have already approved 4,500 units in your master plan areas, but they do have to go through a more discretionary process today. And so one of the recommendations is to streamline development in the Citywalk area as long as they meet objective development design standards to streamline the approval of those 4,500 units. The other program is to comply with SB 330 requirements for objective design standards. And this is something that I believe is already underway, but as its part has a lot of actions, meaningful actions relating to the 5 themes of affirmatively furthering fair housing we talked about. And I would have to say this program and the adequate sites program would be the most difficult review by the state based on our experience in Southern California. So with that, that's like the housing element in a nutshell. But there are some critical timelines that we have to meet. As I mentioned before, the housing element has to take a 30-day public review. And during this 30 days, we are conducting a couple housing additional meetings in order to receive public input. There are 3 meetings planned. And certainly with you tonight, and then the Housing Advisory Committee in a couple of days. We go back to the Planning Commission and City Council again, just to get an affirmation that the housing element is what you feel is adequate and appropriate for your community. Then we need to submit that to the state for a 90-day review. This is a little bit different than before. It used to be a 60-day review, but because there's been so much changes in state law, the state feels that like 90 days is more appropriate. So there's been a new change in state law to require that review to be 90 days. Every round, the first round would be 90 days. During that time when the state is having the review of the draft housing element, the environmental team partner will be conducting the EIR. We anticipate to get comments back from the state in September, and usually it will take a couple of months to go through their comments, make revisions, and what we do intend to do is adopt the housing element by November or so, November, December, concurrent with the rezoning. So with that, I conclude my presentation. I'll pass it back on to Cindy.
Cindy.
Okay. So just to close out here, we've done quite a bit of outreach to the community. You might have seen us at farmers markets recently, or you'll be able to talk more with staff at the Art and Wind Festival, newsletters, email blasts. We have our planceremone.com webpage that we've created where you can provide comments and check for project updates. The draft element is available there for the public to review. And so with that, we are taking questions and comments from the council and commission this evening, as well as public comments. We're hoping to gather as many of those as possible so that we can start looking at how to respond to that when we come back to you on June 21st. As Veronica mentioned, there are a number of ways to provide comments. Emailing the planning department or planning division is the most direct way to get those comments over to us. You can also submit written comments, but we'll compile all those and bring that back June 21st so that you can see all the comments that we've received. So with that, that concludes our presentation. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, let me proceed this way. I will ask if there are any council members or commissioners that have any questions of staff before I move to open the public hearing. Looking to my right, do I have any questions? Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a couple of quick, I think, technical questions. One relates to section 11.4.7.3 on page 100 of the packet, relating to the city of San Ramon has not yet petitioned to become an entitlement community. I'd like to find out if you could just real quickly just talk to us about what it would mean for the city to become an entitlement community in terms of our costs and our benefits. I wanted to find out a little bit about what we're doing to preserve the at-risk affordable housing units that are set to expire this year. That was my second question. And then my third question, I wanted to find out if we can get an estimate of how many people have signed up for the plan email blast. I see we only had 296 community responses, so I'd like to understand a little bit more about that outreach.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and take the first question related to entitlement communities, just kind of for the benefit of the public. After a city gets to a certain size in population, there's an opportunity for the city to run programs to provide access to funding and housing opportunities that that would be specifically geared towards residents and the community of San Ramon. That generally is at about 50,000 population, is usually the trigger when cities, instead of using the county broader base of services that are provided by Contra Costa County, that the cities have the ability to start their own program locally. The city hasn't pursued that option. We are still working through Contra Costa County for them to provide those services to our community, which means that community members have access to those resources. They would just look for those opportunities through Contra Costa County rather than locally through a staff person in San Ramon. At this point, we don't have a program that would bring those services and create that staff person in San Ramon. Planning a number of years ago was absorbed into the Planning and Community Development Department. And so at this time, there isn't a dedicated staff person for that. So we do work with Contra Costa County to operate that program, but it isn't something currently that we have a program for.
Okay, thank you.
Related to expiration of units, for units that are at risk, there are certain requirements that the state has in terms of notification to those residents, outreach that cities are required to do to property owners. We have done outreach to property owners and have started to engage them about what their intent for their units are. The majority of the property owners have indicated that they have are not interested in extending their rent or their affordable housing agreements beyond the expiration date, and that they have started to provide notices to property residents for the expiration of those units. Part of that is just in this particular market, because San Ramon does not have a lot of apartments. It can be difficult to incentivize a property owner to continue those affordable housing agreements without a large amount of subsidies to be able to extend those agreements. So at this time, we don't have a lot of interest from the property owners to extend those agreements. And then the last question, just on the Plan San Ramon mailing list. I think there's 125 that have signed up for the email list to be on our interest list. There is activity of people visiting the site, but they may not necessarily want to be on the email list. So in addition to that email list, we're also doing newspaper ads for meetings, next door social media posts. We also have a citywide newsletter. We've done 2 of those newsletters that have arrived on people's mailboxes, and another one going out this summer, and a number of other opportunities, flyers translated into other languages to try to get more involvement from people who may not necessarily, English is not their first language. So a number of outreach opportunities, and then also our housing page has several thousand people that are on that list. We do email to those individuals as well.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Burrows.
Thank you, Cindy. I'll piggyback on the second question, the 4 risk properties. Are we talking about Mill Creek and what is it, Canyon Lakes, Mill Creek, Canyon Oaks, Falcon Bridge,
Falcon
and
Bridge.
Cornerstone, I think.
That's correct, right?
Okay. So they're like within Mill Creek, Canyon Oaks, Falcon Bridge itself, like 896 units, right? Okay.
Correct.
So I saw, I read where you mentioned about different options. So do you need any guidance on that from council or from planning commission, or what exactly we are looking for?
So there's a couple of different parts related to the housing element. We have to identify units that are at risk, and then there are actions that cities have to try to take to be able to preserve those units. And if there are funding sources that are available or other incentives that the city can offer, those are potentially those action items or more council decisions and goals and policy direction to the city. But at this time, funding is fairly limited as far as how to extend those programs or those units in particular. We have looked at other opportunities, in particular with Doherty Valley. There are still some additional opportunities within that area, and whether or not extensions or relocations could happen in other units that exist in Doherty Valley. And at least if there is no interest in extending, potentially to look at how can we relocate within San Ramon. And so those are the different tools that we have. But because of just the large amount of subsidy it would take to supplement from market rate rent costs to a below market rate, times 900 some odd units, it can get quite expensive as a city to maintain a program to extend that affordability.
Yeah, definitely it is going to be significant financial impact on us. Okay, On adopt for the critical timeline, I see adopt housing element update. Here I see by November 2022, but somewhere I read Jan 2023. Am I looking at different thing here?
Sure. So our goal, the statutory deadline that the state has when we change over from our 5th cycle that we're currently in right now to the 6th cycle, that officially changes on January 31st, 2023. So the deadline that the state has established is that our housing element should be adopted and certified by that time. Our goal is to, because we have Measure G that requires us to go through 3 public hearings and 3 Planning Commission and City Council meetings, it then starts our timeframe for adoption much sooner than January 2023. And so that's building into that timeframe, the local process that we have to adopt the general plan and housing element.
Sounds good. On my next question is regarding packet page 12. The city is updating the general plan in conjunction with this housing element update and addition of the new environmental justice element. Just want to understand what is this environmental justice element is about.
Yeah. So the general plan currently has a number of elements that are required by state law, our housing element and a number of other chapters that are specifically required for the city to adopt. In 2016, the state added an additional element or chapter of your general plan that needs to be included with any time that you're going to make 2 or more element changes. You also have to then adopt an additional element called environmental justice. It's just a way to continuously rolling to get all cities to eventually adopt a environmental justice chapter. Environmental justice chapter is really to address unique or compounding health risks for communities. And the intent is to analyze if there are any pollution exposures or increase to how do we increase or improve overall health within your community. And so it's making doing some analysis of, are there any local pollution or other health risks that the population may be exposed to, and then how do we develop policies to limit or minimize that pollution exposure. So it's one of the elements that you'll see as part of the general plan update.
Oh, so okay. So only pollution, no pollen. Like I see.
Not yet.
Good.
So a couple more questions, sorry. Couple more questions. One is regarding packet page 54. I see city center, there will be 20 to 60 units that are going to be increased. The number of units that can be built per space, what are the spaces going to be approved, right? So is this going to help us? Is this number is already taken in consideration when we approved in the past, or is this going to help us in our future RENA numbers?
I'm sorry, which particular project is it?
It's a city center mixed use. I saw at packet page 54.
Oh,
It says
the zoning designation for city center mixed use. So that zoning designation already exists in our zoning ordinance document. And it's one of the tools that we created in our last housing element update in order to allow for additional residential development within the city center area. We adopted the city center mixed use zoning designation that has a bit of an increase of range, and then it was applied to a number of different parcels within the city. That is just going to continue to be extended into our next housing element and our zoning ordinance, and we'll just continue to help facilitate development on those parcels that have that CCMU designation. We are looking, when you look at the housing opportunity sites map, there are other opportunity sites that have been added within the core of the city, but the zoning designation is just one tool to be able to implement the opportunity sites that we've created.
So for some reason, I thought it is changing from 20 to 40, from 20 to 40 to 20 to 60 units. So
Um, so, so to clarify, we have existing zoning standards. Packet page 54 represents what currently exists today. And that's in that chapter, that's an analysis of what currently exists today. In the housing plan, you'll see, in particular in the appendix, some new designations that we've identified that has the 20 to 60 range as well as the 20 to 40 range. That's just an expansion of what we have right now. You'll see what the proposed density ranges are going to be in the appendix.
okay. And my next question is regarding packet page 100 about affordable housing fund. We have a balance of 4.28 million, right? So as just now you mentioned, there is a scope that we are going to lose there is a risk of losing 4 different properties. And so do we have like any tools or like models that we can use to forecast what the money that we need or financial needs that we need to be ready for our future necessities for affordable housing?
So I guess the best way to answer that is that when you look at the 22 programs that we have put into our housing element, a number of those are opportunities that the city is creating to be able to allow for development to occur to meet our RENA numbers. And then there are other programs that are programs that the city has to implement in order to meet the objectives of our goals of our housing plan. Some of those programs do have costs associated with them. The grant program for home rehabilitation and a number of those other programs that on an annual basis, the city council may set direction on how much to put towards that funding. Over these next 8 years, after we implement and adopt these housing elements, you'll have opportunities to provide guidance to staff on what programs we should be focusing some of that funding for. But what's currently in the housing, the inclusionary housing ordinance, and where we're getting that funding for that housing fund, there isn't a set amount that we can project out on annually what will come into that fund. And so it's a little difficult to project out how much of those programs and how much to allocate for each of those programs. We do 5-year projections of what new development will occur, and that will give us a good or better gauge as to how much more funding we can allocate to programs over those 8 years.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Wallace.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions. I'm going to try and make a couple of them short. The last one's going to be sort of an open-ended question.
Okay.
The first question I had actually had to do with the city center mixed use that was asked about earlier. My question is this: the existing bracket for density is 22 to 50 dwelling units per acre. You're proposing to raise the upper limit to 60, which I understand. What is the rationale for dropping the minimum number from 22 to 20?
The 20 to 60, currently, when you look at the appendix, that's where you're seeing the 20 to 60. So if people are trying to follow along, that's where some of those density ranges that we're talking about tonight, that's the information that's in the proposed zoning column of that table. The suggestion had been for some of those sites, some of them are smaller parcels and some of them are larger parcels. And as we get into the zoning standards, which is really the next phase of this review that we're doing after the housing element gets sent to the state, is refining what those development standards are going to look like on within each of those zones. Right now, the goal is to create a range that would have flexibility. 20 to 60 gives opportunities for some sites that may have an existing use or an existing building to be able to use a portion of that parcel where you can maintain the existing building or existing use on site and then layer on opportunities for residential on that property. And then you'll have other sites where the flexibility of the higher end of the range can provide more options for a property owner to look at whether or not it's feasible to take out the existing use or the existing building on site. If there's enough incentive there to get additional units, that the higher range will allow for more flexibility to potentially incentivize taking out the existing uses there. And so it's really just a tool to create more flexibility, because we're acknowledging that some sites are not going to be complete tear down, and that it's going to try to preserve or at least give the opportunity to preserve some of the businesses that are there, or whatever uses that might currently be there.
Okay, thank you. I'm also going to ask a question about packet page 1, which is entitled Financial Resources. I had 2 questions, but Commissioner Edwards beat me to question number 1. Question number 2 has to do with another question regarding our Affordable Housing Fund. The report says that there's a balance in it right now of about 4.3 million. My question is this: I believe that the city committed funds from this fund for use in the Aspen Woods Senior Housing Project. And my question is the 4.3 million that appears on packet page 100 take into account the commitments the city has already made for Aspen Woods? In other words, this 4.3 million is free and clear of any commitments for Aspen Woods.
It does,
That is
let
the
me-
fastest I've ever seen you jump up.
I'm just buying time until Debbie gets up here.
Springs up here might be more.
Good evening,
appropriate.
Mayor, members of the council and commissioners tonight. So the 4.3 million that's you see in the fund right now, that is committed to Aspen Wood.
Is.
And so, yeah, we have structured the loan commitment that the fund does not go negative while we are receiving the affordable housing funds from the Free or Preserve project, which is about $9 million. So really that fund is fairly well committed for the next 3 to 4 years.
Right. So I think the short answer to my question is the 4.3 is already committed and we're waiting for about 9 million to come into from Faria.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. You want to stay up here or do you want it the next question?
No,
Depends what it
it
is.
isn't a question of whether she wants to. What's the next question?
All right, the next question is on packet page 118. This has to do with program 14, which is by right approval. And the staff report indicates that there are certain rules that apply for by right approval depending upon certain things on the 4th and 5th housing element allocations for lower income. The question is, I looked at the housing element from our last cycle, which is general plan, I think 2030, or might have been 2035, but the appendix does not list any allocations of the housing units to any income category. So my question is, I think I figured out which properties may fall into certain groups like the vacant properties. So my question is, where would I find what allocation to the various income brackets had been made to the 4th and 5th housing cycle housing opportunity sites?
I'll let Cindy take that one, actually.
Okay.
And you're absolutely right with that observation. Unfortunately, when we wrote the 4th cycle housing element, we didn't know that there will be these new requirements coming in that subject them to, particular requirements. So the way we, when the 4th cycle housing element was done was that we have the RENA, we have, units that we can credit, and then we have the remaining RENA, and we have all these sites that are at least 30 units to the acre that can accommodate. And we didn't say which one will be for which income category because we have all the sites that we feel that were adequate to comply. And there was not a requirement to specifically say which site for which income category at the time. But now with the new requirement, they kind of slap the new requirement on us retroactively to things that we didn't know. And so unfortunately, most of the fourth cycle sites becomes eligible because of that.
Okay, that I'm not sure that quite answers my question. I think it gets down to it, which is for the fourth and fifth cycle, we do not have any documented allocation of the housing opportunity site units between the income brackets. Is that right?
There should be in the fourth cycle and the fifth cycle, there is an appendix. They all have an appendix that to show which other sites used in the housing element for the RHNA. There should be an appendix for it. So I'm not sure whether that is totally accurate, but for the fifth cycle, but definitely there is an appendix in the fourth cycle that talks about which are the remaining sites available for RHNA.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that sometime between now and the end of the year, we're going to get a breakdown of allocation of low and moderate and very low for the fourth and fifth cycle housing units so we can figure out which ones are going to fall into the by right approval category?
It's actually in the appendix right now. It should be in the appendix right now that says which one comes from the fourth and fifth cycle. There are 622 units that came from the fourth and fifth cycle sites.
Okay, no, I understand that, but we'll work that out later. I have one more question, and that is the open-ended question. And the open-ended question is this: Commissioner Marks, who could not be here tonight, prepared a list of questions for staff. And his hope was that at some point during the process tonight, staff would provide answers voluntarily or otherwise. So I wanted to ask you or your cohorts from the planning department, are any of you prepared to answer any of Commissioner Marks's questions tonight?
Well, we could take a
And
shot
how
at
long do you
it.
want your meeting to run?
Well,
After
we're
this.
on the planning commission. We go till 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock all the time. So
In the morning?
I don't think we've gone in the morning. We did on GPRC, but not on this.
Cindy's thinking about it. No,
Okay.
go ahead and
Well,
ask him.
I guess it depends on, is there a particular question that you'd like for us to answer?
No, I'm
from his-
sort of standing in for Commissioner Marks. If you haven't had adequate time to come up with answers to each of these questions, that will be, I think, sufficient. We'll deal with it maybe at the ad hoc committee or something like that.
That might be better in light of the time.
Yeah, I think some of his questions do pertain to the retail
Yeah.
and housing mix, and we do have an ad hoc committee that will be meeting to talk about exactly that ratio and how we set it up. So I think the summary of his questions is, what balance do we want for retail and housing? How do we continue to maintain that? And I think the ad hoc committee is meeting later this month, 2 commissioners and 2 council members to discuss that.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to put on the record that, Commissioner Marks's wish to actually bring this and put it on the record was honored by at least the planning commission. So thank you.
Okay, Corey Edwards. Oh, you didn't? Okay, for some reason. Oh, Sabina. No, did you just speak?
No,
questions?
I figured if I want to speak next, I should push this button.
And after that, I'll move to open the public hearing, but go ahead.
So has staff explored or has recommendations in a downtown zone increasing height limits?
So that's going to be part of our conversations. We move forward with the zoning standards component of our update. Certainly, that is one objective standard that the city will need to establish for that downtown area. We have our existing height standards, but if there are considerations that we need to take for these areas that are going to be at higher density, we would certainly want to have those conversations now. If there are some suggestions that we can look at as we start to create what those standards are, it would be helpful to have some feedback on that early on.
Yeah, because we can do it one of the two ways, right? We want to concentrate our housing in the downtown area. We want to protect our hills. We want to keep, kind of everything concentrated. And we're still trying to figure out which shopping centers and places we can put some of these houses versus if we were to have an open discussion about height limits and a certain zone of the city, which could go to, different height limits than the rest of the city. How do we, it would make things a lot more easier for us instead of spreading, keeping them concentrated and yet meeting some of our goals. So maybe this is going to be a discussion after we open it up for public comment, but I did want to put it out there that that's an option we should start talking about at least.
Okay, we're on questions still. You have another.
That was my question, that if you've explored it and if there's
Okay.
any recommendation.
Okay, then I've got Scott Perkins, and then Corey, you keep popping up. You don't want it. Okay. After your questions, I'll open the public.
Well, I would tend to agree. We ought to talk about height limits. Isn't that subject to our legal agreement that came from the city center lawsuit? And so we would have to get the parties of the lawsuit to agree to change that limit. Is that right? Okay, it's subject to that limit based upon the agreement in that lawsuit.
That's correct.
Okay. And I got to give the commissioners a lot of credit because they asked them questions. So
Oh,
thank you.
great job, commissioners. I'll move to open the public hearing. Do I have a second? Oh, Mark didn't use his speaker thing. Okay,
I
Mark.
did. Well, I don't know. I hit the thing. I guess it didn't show up.
Okay, your questions?
Just a general question. Early on in the presentation, there was reference to the, excuse me, the urban growth boundary. And it sounds like, what we're talking about tonight is not relative to any changes to the urban growth boundary. But I guess my question is, because that's got to be reviewed as part of the general plan update, when does that information get factored into the housing element update? If there is going to be any change to the urban growth boundary?
Sure. So regarding the urban growth boundary and how it relates to the housing element, currently our housing element draft identifies housing opportunity sites that are completely within the urban growth boundary area. And so from a just a housing element and UGB standpoint, there is no requirement to expand or modify the urban growth boundary as a result of the housing element. There is still a policy in the general plan that does require us to do periodic reviews of the urban growth boundary, and we would be doing that as part of the general plan update. And so we would just revisit that as we get into the land use and growth management elements. When we bring those back to these bodies, we will have the analysis and policies related to urban growth boundary then.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The other question I had was, again, just sort of really a general question. In the majority of the draft document, there's a lot of references to statistics and reports and things like that. And they all seem to have different dates and as of and things like that. For example, homelessness reports and unhoused or area median income. There's the real estate data, census data is in there. Everything's got kind of a date stamp to it, but is there a certain cutoff that the state requires that as of a certain date, this is what your housing element report is, data has to reflect?
I'm going to turn that one over to Veronica.
I think we try to use the most current available, but because different types of data comes from different sources and then done different times. But the centerpiece of a lot of the statistics actually came from ABAG. It's developed as a data package for all the jurisdictions in the ABAG region to use for the housing element update. So we try to be using that as much as possible and only supplement it with other data sources like the homeless. They only take, the point in time count every other year or so. So, but technically, no, there's no particular requirement as to what cutoff date, and we just try to use what's most recently available for that type of information.
Okay. And I think my final question, I think, has already been answered, and that was really about the ad hoc committee on the mixed use. So that, I guess they haven't met yet. So, but really my question was, how and when is that information going to get incorporated into the housing element update? But I think I heard the answer to that.
Right. So we have some tentative dates set for our first mixed use ad hoc meeting towards the end of this month. And then just to continue those conversations as we get through the HCD review, those 90-day review, we're hoping that through that ad hoc committee, the mixed use and how it affects housing opportunity sites and how that addresses retail will be done this summer, so that we can make sure that a lot of the discussions about mixed use are actually going to go into the land use element, where that actually guides the policy of how that land is going to be used and utilized. Housing element will really just set which sites are going to have what units and what yield. And then how do we, the issues that we've been trying to address about preservation of retail and other commercial uses, that's really more land use policies that are going to be set so that they both will work in partnership with each other.
Okay, because I certainly see that linkage between the land use piece and the housing element, and I certainly think it's got to be incorporated in there. But that's all the questions I have for now. Thank you.
Okay, you got a motion, Hudson, second Perkins. Who hasn't voted yet? Use your little yes, no, or whatever, or abstain. We got 5 of 8. Do we have 6? We have 6 of 8. We're waiting for Armstrong and Albert.
I'm not seeing the vote screen.
Okay. Oh, nope. We're still 6 of 8. Can you take care of these rookies?
I will verbally, affirmatively say yes, but I don't see it on my screen.
Okay. Well, let's end the vote. It's 8 of 8. Is that okay with you, Christina? You got it. We're okay. I guess I should have asked if there was any further discussion, but I did say if there isn't any further discussion, let's open up public comment. See if there's anyone in the public who wants to address this. Do we have any cards, Christina? Are we
don't.
on Zoom or *9, or is it just us?
We are on Zoom, yes. And
Okay, do we
there's-
have anyone on Zoom that wants to speak? And it's
We
8
do
of 8, not
receive
7.
any speaker cards for this item? There are 16 people in attendance on Zoom, and we do have 1 hand raised.
Okay, let's bring that one hand in and hear from them.
Jim Blickenstaff.
Jim, you got the floor.
Good evening.
Good
evening. Good evening. Good evening.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, I just wanted to summarize some points that come up as we talk about housing, and actually a very singular focus on housing. And you're missing a key component of that focus, which is very obvious to me, is the degrading of quality of life. And that is so obvious in some of these bills where they say to facilitate housing, that's the key word, we're going to lower fees, we're going to lower standards, we're going to lower mitigations, we're not going to focus on parks. And this attention to housing at any cost is really a danger to cities and what the city will be in 20 years. So I think we got to realize the full picture here when we try to chase all these huge numbers from the state and ABAG. that there's going to be severe consequences if we go along. Now, there is something that's going on. There is a HCD audit that had some irregularities that bears on some issues that HCD has brought up. And I believe there's a pending lawsuit as well. So I think the city attorney needs to evaluate that in terms of context of what that may foretell for the future. That's part of the equation now. In terms of the city itself, in terms of managing these terribly high numbers, I think one of the key ways to try to do that as best you can, it's a losing battle, is to focus on retail, as mixed use retail, as a viable component, an essential component of the city. With all these thousands of people coming in, established retail centers are going to be critically important. And that's some wiggle room there. I assume the city can handle that to some degree. I give you an example of the marketplace, which is established retail. It's been there for decades. And with the thousands of people moving into Bishop Ranch, I think it'll be a viable location for retail in the future, an essential location. And it'd be a shame to convert that to just more intense housing and then exacerbate the problem of services and negative consequences from this emphasis of housing. So that's the essence of my speech tonight.
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else wishing to speak? Raise your hand or dial *9. Who do we have though? It's *9 or the raise your hand.
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. Please come on in.
Byron Day Arikal.
Okay, Byron, you have the floor. We're going backwards.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Hudson. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Mayor Hudson and Vice Mayor Veros and members of the commission and city council. My name is Byron DeArkle. I'm Consulting Director of Entitlement Planning and Communications with TRC Retail. We are the owners of the San Ramon Marketplace. I think I wanted to first thank very much your planning staff, Ms. Chamberlain, Mr. Barr, Ms. Yee, for a really robust community outreach effort and stakeholder outreach effort on your housing element update. They reached out to us and we were part of the stakeholder interviews, and we very much appreciated that they asked us to provide input, which we did. It's reflected in your draft housing element, which we also appreciate. So thank you very much for that. I think what I'd like to focus on a little bit this evening is the concurrency of your general plan update relative to the housing element. And I certainly understand why you want to do that given time constraints. And also the objective that Commissioner Marks has articulated often and totally understand it, retail preservation. We appreciate that objective. So I think my question is, one, there's been mention of a retail analysis in the past in order to inform the commission and the council as to what preservation of retail means and what that will look like ultimately. And what we're unclear of is, one, is that going to be the retail analysis that kind of formed the basis of your economic development strategic plan in 2019, or whether there's going to be a new retail analysis done to kind of understand where retail is going post 2019, given the fact that we've had a pandemic, people's consuming habits have changed, and the advent of e-commerce as it continues to creep forward. What will retail look like, and what will that mean in terms of retail preservation? So I think our concern is that the discussion of retail preservation, which is an important topic and needs to be discussed, and in the context of rezoning, where you have to rezone certain properties, bring them into a residential element on your housing element, we're a little bit concerned about rezoning properties that are currently mixed use into straight retail or consumer uses without understanding what the retail environment might look like 5 years from now or 7 years from now. So our preference would be that the whole of the marketplace, at least the shopping center proper, which is about 12.5 acres, remain a housing opportunity site as it is in your fourth and fifth cycle elements. And then make sure we're engaged, all shopping center owners engaged in a new retail analysis so that the objectives and strategies you come forward with in preserving retail in the general plan update are based on current understandings of where retail is going and how it will continue to function as both regional retail base and resident serving retail base in a mixed use environment. So thank you very much for your time, Mayor Hudson, Vice Mayor Veros, and I appreciate the work of your staff and the work you're doing on this. Thank you.
Yes. Regarding the marketplace, could you please repair or replace the window frames on your shopping center? They are a disgrace. They are rotting. The only thing that's not rotting is the brick, but the window frames are falling apart. I've asked this number of times from whenever your agency comes before our council and nothing gets done. I'm really disappointed. And I think you would take better care of your shopping center.
Okay, next speakers, do we have any on Zoom or who's next?
Call in user 1.
Call in user 1, you have the floor.
Hi, I apologize. I wasn't able to participate from the beginning to the end. So I am just speaking from what I had reviewed that was attached to the agenda. I just feel that this bill that is coming from top down can be very illogical because they don't really know what kind of land we have. We have lots of still open space that, you know, I'm sure a lot of developers would want to develop, but they are not necessarily geological feasible or sound, or if, you know, that will be the case, lots of money will have to be invested. However, those are all not, you know, taken into consideration in the bill. So I would just like to ask the staff, are you like a one-way, you know, receptor where you can only receive what comes from the top, or are you a two-way, you know, communicator that you can also, you know, timely and wisely, you know, raise concerns regarding these legislations on behalf of our residents and the city council. You know, of course, it's very easy for you to come and tell our council members and, you know, planning commissioners what to do, because for all the meetings I've been participating, they are very accommodating people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's in our best interest. So as a public, I would like to see our staff doing more of a bargaining negotiation type of action with the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another on Zoom? Who's next?
Beverly Wallig.
Beverly, you have the floor. And do we have any on phone or is it just all Zoom?
It's both through this.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Beverly Wallig. And I just want to reiterate about the marketplace development. I know Nob Hill has left, but now the nearest full service grocery store is one of the two Safeways, or the Lucky's down on El Costa and San Ramon Valley Boulevard. If you end up putting residential condominiums in there, residential homes, and demolishing part of that marketplace, the traffic is going to be unbelievable. It's already bad and it's going to get so much worse. I mean, even when you're coming down Bollinger Canyon to take a right on Marketplace, there's just a little tiny turn section. Otherwise, it's going to be backed up. You know, there needs to be more of a turn aisle put in, and it's going to be crazy. So I just want to say that I think we should keep that retail place and get another grocery store in there. So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Beverly. Who's next?
Paul Bickmore.
Paul, you have the floor. Need to start the timer over.
Hello. Thank you. One of the things about the housing element is we're actually required to actually get these housing units or homes really produced, not necessarily just zoned. It actually just has to happen. And a couple other speakers have been talking about quality of life issues. And I think since this is inevitable that we have to add more density in order to provide for housing for people, that means that this has to be human scaled and built around pedestrians and cyclists and transit, and not cars. Cars would just be, an apocalypse if we did that. And one of the big issues that destroys quality of life, causes these apartment buildings to be kind of enormously blocky, horrible for raising kids, as well as incredibly expensive, prohibitively expensive, which means that, often cases they just don't get built and therefore we're in violation, is the parking. And in order to get things built and transition to a human scale traditional type of high density that we need to provide for housing, I think we need to be looking at getting rid of a lot of these minimum parking requirements that make it so expensive to develop and just invite traffic and cars in and make the housing that does get built just so blocky and miserable. So yeah, I encourage you that to make this work, look at the reducing or getting rid of the parking requirements in a lot of these area plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Next speaker, please.
It looks like that was the last hand raised.
Okay, so we have no more Zoom hand raised and no more *9. Do we have any other written comments besides the one we received from West Side?
The only written comment I received was from Ralph Ballard.
Okay, and we have that in
And
front
that
of
was
us.
provided to both the commission and council.
Okay, seeing no other written comments, we will close the public comment and. Okay, second for Rose. Any further discussion on? Okay, cancel your motion for a minute. Cancel the public comment. We actually have someone here. We should be embracing them to come to the forefront to speak. Hi. See, we're not used to this, having people come and speak. We haven't been here for 3 years. Go ahead.
My computer wouldn't load the meeting ID, so I just rushed here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Allison. I've been in San Ramon since 2018, and I moved from another state with a hope for a better life. I applied for several housing waitlists when I first moved. Sorry,
That's okay.
I'm a little nervous because this is my first time talking to this many people in 3 years.
Me too.
I applied for several housing wait lists when I first moved. These wait lists no longer exist. My income remains steady between $38,000 and $45,000 a year, which is actually average for persons identifying as female in Contra Costa. San Ramon claims to have 13 affordable housing complexes, but only 9 of them are accessible to me based on age. And of those 9, only 5 are actually low income or very low income, according to San Ramon's website. For the past 6 months, I have been calling these places. Not only do they claim that the San Ramon website is wrong and they do not provide low income housing, there are no waiting lists to get on. They tell me to keep calling and I'll get on one when it's ready. but some apartments have stopped answering my calls. None except one gave me an actual price of a low-income apartment, which was $1,566 a month. This exceeds the max rent for very low or low income units by about $300. There's no wait list. There's no knowledge of when an apartment will be available, and then no knowledge if I would even qualify for the rent, as there's no transparency in pricing. San Ramon claims we have anywhere from 622 to 2,840 low-income apartments. On H.2-32, it claims we might lose affordable housing in the future, but I would like to tell you that affordable housing has already been lost. There are no vacancies. There are no affordable homes in San Ramon. In my apartment complex, there are 50 apartments that are empty, and I've counted them. If I assume that there are 400 apartments in my full complex, that's almost 10%. Yet in July, my rent will increase to nearly $2,500, which is 92.6% of my income. Obviously, that's not really feasible, but I have contacted every housing authority and agency and found there is no vacancy anywhere and no one to help. This housing bill is a good draft, but I see nothing here that protects tenants long-term. And instead, there's an assumption that these housing units and these apartment complexes are doing what they are supposed to do. And I'm here to tell you that an apartment complex would rather let an apartment rot empty for years rather than give it to someone who needs it. So as much as I like the plan, I strongly urge you to include protections for years to come for tenants against these companies that merely stall until their low-income contract is up. As for my quality of life, I'm almost homeless and mostly miserable. Although this housing comes a day late and a dollar short, I'm appreciative and I'm glad we're moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And before you make the motion to continue on this thing, the discussion is before the commissioners or the council members, but I will tell you this. I tried to do much of what Allison is saying for somebody I know that could just barely sneak under the very low income, 49,000. And it is amazing how long you can stay on that phone trying to get through. It's a tremendous need. There's far more people looking than there are available, but our housing element right now that we're dealing with is what we're going to be doing in the cycle between 2023 and 2031. So if we can't stay focused on that, any other comments on this? Then I would ask for the motion again, Mr. Perkins, to continue the public hearing to June 21st. Yeah. That's what I just said. If we don't have any more. Okay, let's do close the public hearing and we'll do, go ahead. Motion a second. Is there any comment on the motion a second? Seeing none. I was trying to get this thing through. I thought you guys had a meeting tonight, but I guess it's canceled.
We're all ears tonight.
Okay, we're all ears tonight. So we have 5 of 8 who hasn't voted on. This is to continue the public hearing to June 21st. So there'll be more chances to talk.
Christina,
I was hoping, I'm sorry.
No, after we close the public hearing, we're going to do the discussion on what you've heard tonight.
Okay, we're not just closing the public comment.
No, we've closed the public comment. We are continuing the public hearing.
Okay.
Okay, that's what the motion is about. I'm sorry, I mixed the two.
Christina, I may not be registering because
Yeah.
when I was pressing the button before, he didn't notice I wanted to talk, and now.
Okay, I'm
my
not
vote's
hearing
counting.
anybody on no up here. I don't have any speakers that are registered up here. Yeah. Oh, come on. Now you make poor Gary feel bad. All right. We have showing 6 of 8, but it's 8 of 8 to continue the public hearing with June 21st. Let's do a little discussion on the motion. Well, we don't have that, don't it? I got ahead of myself. Martin, just close your ears. I want to hear comments about what you heard tonight. I'm sorry, but Allison kind of got to me there. Any comments from the commissioners about what you heard and direction you want to give? Okay, Gary, you've been terribly silent tonight. Speak up, and then we'll go to Corey.
Thank you, Mayor. They were going to be questions, but I think I can turn them into maybe comments, and there might be a question in here too. And I did cover these with Cindy earlier. So for the record, the plan that we all reviewed back in March and the plan now, the numbers shifted quite a bit. And I guess my question is, first, why? And second, does it matter that they're between 4, 5, or 6? A housing unit's a housing unit as far as the housing opportunity sites. So I guess that's the question. And then I have comments that I'll have after that.
Yes. So earlier this afternoon, or maybe it was this morning, Commissioner Alpert actually provided us with some tables that showed the differences between the housing opportunity sites list that was provided to the commission and council on March 15th, and then compared that to the housing opportunity sites list that's in your packet this evening. And there's a difference in the number of additional housing units that have been added since March 15th. And as I explained to Commissioner Alpert, a number of those changes were based on comments that we received on March 15th to add some additional opportunity sites. There was 18 Croquet Court, for example. The west of Marketplace, there was some requests for additional parcels to be added to the opportunity sites list. There were comments about Country Club Village to add some additional parcels there, and then to take out parcels related to Magnolia Square. So there have been some edits to the housing opportunity sites, but really just additions that and revisions that had been requested since our March meeting. We did also have some shift of 4th and 5th cycle sites that were on the 4th and 5th cycle list that moved over to 6th cycle sites. That list is still the same site list, but some of those we've moved into the 6th cycle category because there are going to be some zoning changes related to those parcels to better reflect that they're not just staying as 4th and 5th cycle sites with no change. There are going to be some adjustments to density and other things that are happening to the zoning for those sites. So we've moved those into the 6th cycle. But there are some shifts and the buffer has increased because of some of the additional edits that were requested from the last time.
Thank you. Thank you. I think my comments probably for June, to confirm, there's 55 sites that need to be rezoned, and that's in the staff report. And so between now and the end of January, we have to update general plans, zoning ordinances, specific plans. So perhaps in the June meeting, we can map out more of a calendar of that, because that seems like a pretty tall bill of work to get done. No, we'll be happy to stick with it. But my other question, Cindy, is that given that HCD won't respond back until the September timeframe, and then what we learned that's happening in Los Angeles, are these activities sequential? Do we hear back from HCD before we embark on a zoning change, or do we do it in parallel, knowing that HCD's changes may cause us to have to do some rework on the specific plan and zoning changes?
So we will expect to see some comments related to housing opportunity sites from HCD. I think that's a given that there will be comments on the sites that we're using for our list. Our goal is to be able to set up those zoning standards and objective standards that we would be using to implement our goal of creating these opportunity sites as viable sites. And so that's what we're going to be working towards as HCD is taking their time to review our draft. But we will be moving ahead with the list that we have, with the expectation that if some of that changes, we might need to make some adjustments. But the goal is that those rezones will be happening concurrently. And so we're going to be working under the assumption that these are sites that we're going to pursue for rezoning.
Good, that's what I was expecting. I'm continuing to hear questions about the by right approval on the 4th, 5th cycle sites, and there's 15 of them. Maybe in the June meeting, we can get confirmation or better understanding. Are each of those sites subject to by right approval, or some of them are, or it depends? Because it sounds like there's a lot of different flavors of the by right approval.
So I can just generally address that. There are 15 housing opportunity sites that are identified in table D-1 in your packet. 13 of those 15 are considered non-vacant. So 2 of those sites are vacant. The 13 sites that are non-vacant are subject to that by right requirement. And there are certain rules for if in order to qualify for by right, you have to have a certain percentage of affordable units on those sites. And there are a number of other restrictions, but assuming that those 13 sites remain as 4th and 5th cycle sites and we're not making any adjustments to rezoning those sites, if a property owner were to come in with a application to develop that one of those 13 non-vacant sites with 20% or more of affordable low income units, then the by right provisions do obligate the city, already under state law, obligates the city to be able to have no discretionary approval on that. And I'm going to just make sure Veronica's nodding her head yes, but yes, that's
Good.
how that would work.
Thank you. The Citywalk master plan streamlining, which sounds like a terrific idea. The process that will happen, will it end up, the revised process that's developed, will that end up ultimately being approved by the planning commission or city council, or how that will work? And I know we haven't started that effort yet, but
So that's one of the programs that is new in the housing element, is that Citywalk streamlining. There's dates associated with that for when the city is going to revisit it. I don't know if we've really set exactly how we're going to implement that, but it will be one of the actions that the city will have to take. I think some of that depends on the design standards and development standards that are already in place. How are we going to be able to implement that with the tools that we currently have? And do we need more tools in order to be able to easily make decisions on those development when they come into the city?
good. Last is really more of a comment, I think. In the stakeholder interviews, somebody said San Ramon's a tough climate, high fees, tough planning commission, and tough city council, which is good, I guess, but, it feels like we should, and that's in conjunction with some of the programs about eliminating government roadblocks or roadblocks to housing being developed. It feels like that's worthy of at least a discussion at some point about what are the things that get in the way, and is it all external, or is there anything within city control that we should look at? That's kind of a comment, just in general. And that concludes my comments.
Okay, Corey and then Eric, if you have anything.
Thank you very much. So I've got 3 specific comments, and then I've got a more general comment. The first deals with section 1.1.1 on packet page 11 regarding the scope and context of our housing element. The general plan takes advantage of infill opportunities while preserving the valued, quote, quality of life, close quote, aspects of San Ramon. Quality of life means different things to different people, sometimes dramatically different. And I would hazard to guess that Allison's quality of life in the city of San Ramon can be greatly improved. And I think that she is not alone and not even close, particularly when we start talking about losing the affordable units that are out in the Doherty Valley. Given that we've got a tremendous state focus right now on objective standards, I would like us to consider anchoring our housing element in something else. I think that quality of life is inherently subjective. And I think we should be looking at something that more accurately characterizes what is so amazing about our city. We've got, I think, really an opportunity here to have a complete community. We have a thriving office environment. We have a large retail population. We have top tier schools. I think we can do better than quality of life. And I think that we, in view of the state focus right now on objective standards, I think we probably need to start doing a little bit better and articulating a little bit more about what it is that we want to continue to have in our city. The second point I wanted to just quickly touch on is on packet page 110. This is dealing with our rehabilitation grant programs. There's a comment here that the grants are non-repayable. I'm not sure when we have an opportunity to talk about grant programs, but it does seem to me that we should at least look at whether it's always appropriate to have the grants not repayable. I could easily see someone using a grant that they qualify for to improve their home and then sell their home in 2 months to someone who wouldn't benefit from that grant. Having given that $5,000 grant to that person who's then benefited from it and sold their house, if we can get that grant repaid out of their escrow, it seems to me that we then have $5,000 more that we can give to someone else to help them make some improvements. I had some concerns on packet page 117. This is within program 13 of section 11.5.5.3 regarding monitoring to make sure that we have adequate sites for RENA. There's a statement here, should an approval of development result in a reduction of capacity below the residential capacity needed to accommodate the remaining need for lower income households, the city will identify and if necessary rezone sufficient sites to accommodate the shortfall to ensure no net loss in capacity to accommodate the RENA. This is a major concern for me as a planning commissioner and as a resident, because we have seen a fair number of projects recently come to the Planning Commission on a concept review that are proposing to deliver the absolute bare minimum number of housing units for a particular site. I think we as a commission have given feedback to the developers that we expect there to be higher residential density in a particular area. And I think we've tried to signal to the development community that we really need to see more density in areas that are zoned for higher density. Minimum density projects should not be and cannot be the norm in this environment. If that's what we have as the norm, our city is not going to meet our RENA allocation, and there will be adverse consequences as a result of that. So I would put forward that our planning documents need to communicate at least 4 things to the development community in very clear and unambiguous ways. One, I think we have to focus our message that every single unit of housing in this community counts. We have a limited amount of land. We have competing needs for that. We need land for housing, but we also want and need our park space, and we want our open space, and we want our retail space. And so in order for us to have all of those things and meet the competing objectives, we have to have developers come in and be responsible with our resource. And if the site is zoned for 40 units per acre, we'd like to see you do 40 units per acre and maybe come at us when present a density bonus project. We need to communicate that meeting our RENA allocation and building housing is not just an exercise. It's not just a planning exercise. It's actually a priority. Building housing in San Ramon needs to be a priority. And I think that our public planning process needs to reflect that as well. And I do think that our planning documents need to state that we as a community encourage and expect developers to come to us with projects that maximize the potential density on project sites, pursue density projects, pursue density bonus projects. And frankly, if they're not going to do that, I want the development community to justify why they're going to do something less, because our community deserves to meet these RENA numbers. Allison deserves to find a house. So I guess just in closing, I just want to really emphasize that the goal of what we're doing. It's not just an exercise. We are trying to attract private development. We want the private development to come to San Ramon, not go to Dublin, not go to Walnut Creek. We want and need it here. There's been a lot of speculation about what we're going to have in our next bit of housing legislation if we fail to comply with RENA allocations. I think we want to communicate that this community is ready for smart infill development. And if we fail, I'm absolutely confident that by right approval is coming. If we want to try to maintain control over what we have in this city, we've got to hunker down and start making a real point to try to attract development and to attract the right kind of development. So that's my comments.
Thank you, Corey. Eric?
Yeah, I'm going to make my comment extremely short. On packet page 56, there's a description of our inclusionary housing ordinance. And the problem I have with the definition is it's not complete and it's actually misleading. It says that all for sale units, single family, have to have 10% or more affordable units. That does appear in our inclusionary housing ordinance. The problem is that it doesn't stop there. The next sentence talks about the fact that a developer can opt out of creating affordable housing and do a fee-only basis to avoid the actually building affordable units. And we've actually seen projects come in front of us where that is exactly what's happened. So at a minimum, I think the housing element ought to accurately quote what our inclusionary housing ordinance says. And the second thing is that during the general review process, I think we ought to consider rewriting the inclusionary housing ordinance to require the provision of actual affordable units for single family homes. When HAC looked at this a couple of years ago, the image of a single family home was what we had out sort of where I live in Doherty Valley, 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, 2,500 square feet. But what the projects we're getting now aren't like that. And as long as we look at infill, they're not going to be like that. What we get is 1,800 square foot, 2,000 square foot, 3,000 square foot townhomes, 3 stories that are going to go on the market for $1.8 million. That's the type of housing we're going to have in San Ramon, unless we have a great fire and burns down half the city, because all we have is infill left, or unless someone can talk the federal government into letting us annex Camp Parks. Other than that, we're going to have limited ability. And if we really want to meet our affordable numbers, like Commissioner Edwards says, and I think that those of us in the Planning Commission honestly believe that we should, we're going to have to use all the tools in the toolbox. And one of them is to relook at the inclusionary housing ordinance on the for sale side. That's my comment.
Okay, anyone on council with a comment? Before we go ahead, Sabina.
First of all, I really want to thank the commissioners for their comments and thoughtful, and you guys always do such an amazing job of doing, looking at the whole housing element and how we do and plan housing in the city. So really appreciate your opinion and your comments. I just want to give an example. Allison, you mentioned when I moved here 16 years ago, a 2-bedroom apartment was $2,400, and that was affordable in Windermere, where it was twice the price of my 4-bedroom house in Arizona. And this was 16 years ago. Now it's probably like a condo is $2,500, and we call that affordable. So affordable is a very, we just toss it around. We think it's something which is, don't know what's going to bring into town. But if I wasn't able to move here with my 2 kids as a single parent into that affordable house, I wouldn't have been able to build my life, my American dream here. So people need to understand that we can't just move here. I mean, people especially Doherty Valley tell me, no more housing. Well, you wouldn't have been able to move here if we didn't build that housing. So we have to keep an eye on the future of the city, how we are planning for Allison and frankly, our 16, 17-year-olds, that generation. My kids tell me, Mom, we can't move back to San Ramon. What are you talking about? The 20, 24-year-olds, even though they're making a lot of money based on, what we were making years ago, they still can't afford to live here. because what our price is now 800, 900 per square foot. And like you said, our housing, if it's 2,000 square feet, just, calculate what that's like. So one, we have to build smaller, more dense. And then we really have to relook at our height limits. I mean, that's going to be a discussion we need to have, because what got us here is not going to get us there. Rules have changed, laws have changed. California is struggling with housing. Homelessness is not just being on the street. Homelessness is people sleeping in their cars now because they can't afford to live in the city they work in. And I'm a big proponent of the retail housing balance, but I would like to look at some data as to what that ratio looks like. How much housing supports retail as well? If we can't say that 40 houses are going to support retail, right? So I would love to see if staff could bring some data there, some analysis where we can actually make decisions based on data and what that balance looks like. Because I know we all want retail, but we all also want to preserve that retail based on what the population is going to be, because retail won't come if they don't have the right population either. And we may have to go through a retail reanalysis of how we build that and what our mixed use is going to look like. And so I guess my comments here are, again, in line with what the commissioners have already said, that we need to look at building denser housing. We want to preserve the quality of life. And if the quality of life for us is maintaining our open spaces, which I think every council has agreed on and commission has agreed on, then building downtown housing, which is denser, which is walkable, which is bikeable, which is, again, will align with our climate action plan as well. Because as you build up, you use less resources because collectively you're sharing a lot more as well. So I would, recommend and suggest that we relook at some of our zoning that we've held close to heart for the past 40 years almost, and see what the next 40 years are going to look like in San Ramon. Because if we do want Allison to live in San Ramon, if we do want our kids, our grandkids to move back here, and frankly, even for me, it's a waste of time, a waste of space for me to live in a 4-bedroom. But if I don't want to move out of San Ramon, where do I go, right? I don't have a whole lot of options. So we have to look at, I know plenty of people who said, hey, we're empty nesters now. We don't need the big house. The kids are gone. They've started building their own life. Where do we live now? Do we move to Walnut Creek? Do we move to the city? Do we move somewhere where it is more of a lifestyle conducive to people who want to live in smaller spaces, who want to live in communities which are more tightly knit, and want to, be able to afford smaller houses as well. And part of the mix is going to be rental and buying as well, right? So we don't have enough rental units. We need to relook at that as well and see what that percentage is going to look like. So yeah, those are some of my comments and direction.
Okay. Anyone else wish to comment? Go ahead, Scott.
I want to thank the.
Yeah, they were okay.
There we go. I want to thank the Planning Commission for their very thoughtful comments. One of the things that has concerned me in the past and still concerns me is the in lieu fees. Now that this is kind of a tangential, it's not directly in this document, but I think our in lieu fees are too low, and it encourages developers to say, what do you got? What's the minimum build? And I'll pay the rest in an in lieu fee. And we find that our in lieu fees don't go very far in trying to help affordable housing going forward. And I was trying to look up just a moment ago. Fremont, I thought, had a very substantial increase in their in lieu fee. They did a study that showed that they could justify that particular in lieu fee. And so I would hope we could do something similar. And by doing that, we would actually encourage the developer to build the units rather than pay the in lieu fee. because the in lieu fees, we found that we had to pay, what was it, $180 some $1,000 for that unit over on St. Charles, to retain the affordability of that unit. And that was one unit. And there's no way that we're getting $180,000 from in lieu fees, in theory, per unit. So I would like us to revisit our in lieu fee and try and raise it to the maximum we can justify.
Anyone else before I chime in?
Yep. Thanks, commissioners, for all your feedback. It's fantastic. One of the things that I would like to definitely piggyback on is about Commissioner Wallace inclusionary housing ordinance that mentioned, right? So I remember I raised this question in the past about 15% of our development. Anytime we ask developers for 15% to be affordable housing. Is that something that we had to go with that guidelines, or is it can be changed based on our development request? That's actually a question for me, from me, that we need to understand that piece. If not, then maybe we need to definitely look at increasing that so that we can attract more developers. As Commissioner Edwards mentioned, we need to get more traction from the developers so that they can be encouraged to build this affordable housing. That's the only way. The challenges that we are facing currently, especially the challenges of affordable housing for our teachers or our fire district or police department, youth, and as Alison here. So we are seeing there is going to be a lot of population going to be in verge of homelessness. So if we cannot tackle at this point, then it will be already a tipping point for us. So that's one thing we need to definitely look at, I think, to see how we can encourage developers to increase there. And also one more thing, high density. Yes, I definitely favor on that one, but we need to be careful when we say that, because when you see the stats, there is a high chance of increase in segregation housing whenever there is a high density. So I know there should be a balance act. I would definitely like to see how we can do high density housing at the same time, how we can be careful with the not segregation population built around with that. And also one more thing is we already mentioned about this losing our mixed usage. So I'm definitely looking forward for our ad hoc committee, what they're coming out with the percentage wise, so that we can preserve our retail. At the same time, we can provide housing for our community. So that's another thing I definitely want to see. And also, I do keep hearing about concerns from the community. One of the major concerns that they raise whenever we talk about increasing the housing, the challenge that comes up is about traffic and infrastructure. You already do a fantastic job about how you present it whenever we do this. So definitely we need to make sure we have all that info whenever someone questions us, either online or ad hoc questions. When they ask about any development, we should be able to provide them the details on what traffic study we did for a specific development that we are approving. That way we can reduce the hurdles that we can pass those permits or development requests much quicker than making community more concerned and coming and with a lot of questions on those. That's that's pretty much my comments on this. Thank you.
Mark, anything before I finish this?
Yeah, I also appreciate the comments of the commissioners and fellow council members. I think Commissioner Wallace and Councilmember Perkins addressed the point I was going to make on these in lieu of fees and inclusionary housing ordinance fees. It just seems too easy for developers to sort of buy their way out, as opposed to doing what we would prefer them to do in terms of building on a particular project. And then earlier we heard tonight about the retail analysis, and we've talked about this before, and kind of the long-awaited, where is that retail analysis? I don't know what the real story is anymore on, we're coming out of the pandemic. People tend to be working at home a lot more, but yet I see a lot of cars on the road. So I don't know exactly which way this thing is going in terms of do we or do we not need more retail, or do we have enough? And I would sure like to see some kind of statistics on that if it's available before we get to the end of this housing element update. And I think the last thing is that the last time we met, when we got the presentation, there was a map in there. There was numbered housing opportunity sites and things like that. It was easier for me to follow exactly which sites were what. We didn't get into that level of detail tonight, but I didn't see that in tonight's staff packet. But if the presentation the next time we do this lends itself to having the opportunity to have kind of that map and those housing opportunity sites to kind of match one for one what we're talking about as a read ahead, that would be helpful for me. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, let me throw a couple things out. First of all, Veronica, you heard tonight about height and what the lawsuit settlement was over in Bishop Ranch. I would just say, check out, and it's probably a question that's going to end up in Martin's lap. What is the difference between a height for a commercial development and a height for housing? Because if you're doing a building that's within the height limits of that agreement, which I believe was 85 feet, and you're doing 40% affordable housing, or you're entitled to 4 incentives, you get an additional incentive, which is 33 feet or 3 stories. And the choice is the developers. So we want to make sure where we are on that. At least that's the way I read it. A lot of things I heard tonight. First of all, the surplus, don't be shy about going over and getting that surplus, because I have a feeling that's going to be the difference for a lot of people getting their housing element approved and not. I think Hcd is going to take a hard look at that. We don't want to come back and do it again where you're under the gun and you might have 45 days to get it right a second time. The other thing is I asked Debbie to take a look at it, and I really think this is going to change a lot of reality for us versus what might be part of the housing element, but I don't know. And that's AB 2337 Friedman. And I thought of it when Sabina brought up the climate action plan, where transportation dollars that are going towards projects, which will probably include transit-oriented community policy. You're going to see that ARB is going to have a final decision on that, even over MTC, which seems odd for transportation dollars. But I mean, this whole exercise was the melding of transportation and housing through a sustainable community strategy. So where it's going in the next cycle will be very interesting. Then the one that scares the heck out of me, I hate to throw water on what we've been talking tonight, but we all know it. You are not going to make these RENA numbers. It's how good can we do trying to get to these RENA numbers. And what's really going to make it difficult is, I keep using this example, our low and very low are so high percentage-wise that it makes it extremely prohibitive. Well, if for some miracle of a reason, the fees or whatever we're talking about tonight, that 1,497 number for very low, we went to 1,500. We don't have 3 more for low. We've got 1,500 very low. You still have to do your low number and your moderate number. Well, guess what? There's a new cycle, and it just got an endorsement by ABAG, and I really hope this doesn't go to fruition. I can't remember the number, but very low is going to require reporting of how much of that number is extremely low. And from there, it will create a new silo where you'll have extremely low, very low, low. And if you do that, then you're in the same boat if you got extremely low. And I'm for the life of me trying to remember that the legislation or the verbiage that I've seen in the past what part of the very low we do now is extremely low? Was it 50%, 25%? Well, if it's 50%, oh, well, who splits the half, the 7? I mean, you've got to be kidding. We can't make the very low. I don't know how we're going to make it. Our very low is higher than our total number in the 5th cycle. But, that's what we're all trying to do here in the Tri-Valley, and we're going to have to find new ways. I can tell you right now that ABAG is behind me 100% if we go after converting one of the hotels to very low income. It might be the only way you can approach this. The other thing that keeps getting lost is this: no matter what kind of housing or the fees or whatever you do, and I know we want to spread it all around town, but let's stop kidding each other. This was all about vehicle miles traveled and putting people close to jobs, et cetera. There should be a premium for anybody wanting to do very low or low within a half mile of this transit, which is going to be provided as part of the Citywalk. So I know the quality of life is a big thing, but it's kind of hard to sell. We don't have quality of life when they just bragged about what a great livable city we are. And I have since sent it out to all the mayors in the area, so they're all aware of how well we're doing. But the fees part of it, I think I understand where you want to go with it. I think we're all uniform on that. But the fees comes down to the same thing that Scott, you're talking about at TVTC, and I know Robert Storr is going through it now, trying to get Central Sand to back off. Fees increase the cost of what it is for this housing also. And it's not like these guys are just, rolling in it, just throw anything out there. My biggest problem is these people are getting entitlements and not building. And I think that's where that middleman thing is a bigger thing. And I really want to commend what we are getting out of our 2 employees down at the end of the table here, because so far, I think they've been doing a great job. I mean, if we can just get Rome to build, and if we can just get Storr to build, that's fine. But the reality is, after we've spent that $10.5 million or loaned it out, it's gone if we don't get a secondary market. ABAG is starting to listen to that. So we'll see if BAFA wants to do something with that, or the billions of dollars they've been talking about doing it. But there is no way you're going to make 5,000 in very low and extremely low unless you're loaning a lot of money like we are on that 9 million to the 4 million you asked about, Eric. But these are the things we get to deal with in the next several years. What the heck? We've got till 2031, no problem. And besides, our planning commission will come up with an answer. So if we don't have any further discussion, and we've just thrown, go ahead. You want to throw the commissioners under the bus too? It was fun.
I wanted to recommend that for stakeholder interviews, if those are ongoing, we include our high schoolers, because those are the ones that are going to be 36 in 20 years. And Innovation Tri-Valley has some really good data on the future of housing, and interviewing some of actually the college students they've gathered in terms of what are they looking for housing and the future of housing and what that looks like. So if we can incorporate data from somebody under 30, even from our city, from the high schoolers or DVC, that would be great to add to the mix, because I see that unrepresented, at least at what I'm looking at it. I don't know if that's true or not.
Okay. And Gary Alpert wants to chime in as the final word.
Maybe not final. So the task tonight was to give feedback on the housing element and whether we think it's getting close to submit to HCD. And I just want to go on record. I think it is very close. I think most of my comments were about implementation, not about the plan itself. So I'd like to just, throw out that I think the plan is, pretty much there. One more time in June to tweak a little bit, but really the focus after that is really what we can do to implement all of the programs and policies that were spelled out. So
I think I'm saying the same thing, but don't be shy about the surplus, because I think that might make the difference when you get that in there. Those that try and cut it short because they don't want the opposite of what we're saying to do tonight are going to find out that they get to do it again when it comes back to them in September or October, with that deadline of January. And everything I'm hearing is HCD is not shy about kicking stuff out right now. They're feeling their oats. Okay, if we don't have anything more to add, I mean, the august body before you tonight is giving you tremendous direction, or have we? That nod did not tell me that you got tremendous direction. But if you don't want to hear any more, if you don't have anything else to chime in, we are adjourned to the next continuation of the meeting, which I believe will be June 21st.